So hello, thank you so much for coming this morning. Thank you for coming out early. I'm really excited to have you all here. I'm Dr. Emma Beckett, and I'm from a company called FOODiQ Global. And I'm here today to talk to you about milk and gut health for Gut Health Month, which is just wrapping up. So I'm really grateful that you're here. The fact that you're here says to me that you either care a lot about milk, you care a lot about gut health, or maybe you already know about how the two go together. But what it really says to me that you're here this morning is that you're willing to learn something new or look for a new perspective. And so for me, that says you are my people, and I'm very glad to meet each and every one of you. Before I start, I want to tell you a little bit about myself so that you know where I'm coming from. So I started my work in gut health back in my PhD. My PhD was about the relationship between certain micronutrients, genetics, environment, and gut health outcomes, particularly in later life. And then in my postdoc, I studied the relationship between taste receptors, the microbiome in the gut, and gut health outcomes. And so you've probably already twigged that those are slightly out of the ordinary questions to be asking. And that's kind of who I am as a person, and that's kind of what I'm going to do today, give a different view on something that we all think about a lot. And the reasons for that is partly because of my background. So I have a very diverse academic background. I have a degree in biomedical science with honours in immunology and microbiology, a graduate diploma in epidemiology, a graduate certificate in nutrition, a master's in science management, and a PhD in food science and human nutrition. So all of that education together, as well as my work experience with FOODiQ Global and in the academic research space, is how I arrived at this slightly different view. And it's also because of who I am as a person. I am always the person in a room who's going, what haven't we thought about here? And have we really thought through what we're doing to the potential unintended consequences? And so I'm an identical twin. I'm one of 10 siblings. And so I've spent my whole life thinking about how we can all be the same but still respond differently to food. So that's where my kind of different perspective and different take kind of comes from as a person. So I'm very lucky that with that diverse background and that diverse view of the world that I get to work for FOODiQ Global, and our CEO, Dr. Flavia Fayette-Moore, is here today, and I'm very grateful for that. FOODiQ Global is a team of scientists, food scientists, nutrition scientists, dietitians, teachers, nurses, and a whole bunch more. And our mission is essentially to make the world a better place through food. And one of the ways we do that is by working with companies like A2 Milk. And A2 Milk are our sponsors here today. They're supporting this talk this morning. But I want to make it really clear that A2 did not put any words in my mouth. Anyone who has met me or seen me on the internet knows it's impossible to put words in my mouth anyway. But I did steal some inspiration from the A2 colour palette, and I have stolen one image from their website because they'd already done it real nice and I couldn't have done it better. So I'm speaking from my interpretation of the science today. I'm not speaking from anyone else's point of view. With all that said, let's get into the actual science so that I can tell you about milk, which today I'm framing as the forgotten superhero of gut health. So let's center ourselves on gut health and why gut health matters. So for a lot of people, when we think about gut health, we think about symptoms and those really negative symptoms that can come with gut health challenges. And so we're talking about things like bloating and nausea, urgency, constipation, diarrhea, pain. And those are really common symptoms. So in cross-sectional studies in Australia at any one time, 50% of Australians can be experiencing those symptoms. 1 in 7 Australians say they experience them regularly and severely. And so these symptoms are very impactful on quality of life, and they can impact on productivity, our ability to work and be productive in the environment. And these are not nothing symptoms. So I remember the first time that I ever experienced bloating. I'd spent years in gut health research asking people about their bloating symptoms and thinking it was a mild symptom. The first time I experienced bloating, I nearly went to the hospital because I did not know that it could be that severe. And so I do want to remember that these symptoms are potentially very debilitating for people. But gut health is so much more than just symptoms. So gut health is about overall health, and it's not just about the absence of disease and the absence of symptoms. So just like our definition of health from the World Health Organization is about a holistic state of well-being, mental, physical, as well as social, so is gut health. And our gut impacts on the rest of our body in so many ways. And so our gut is one of our largest organs in the body and one of our largest surface areas that is exposed to the outside world. And it's where that interface happens, where we meet the food that we eat. So obviously important roles in health through digestion and absorbing those nutrients, but also as a really large organ, that's where 80%, almost 80% of our immune cells live. So the cells that are going to be responding to pathogens and to responding to the everyday environment. And through that, as well as the action of our microbiome, that regulates our inflammation outside of our gut as well. And through that, we have links from our gut to a whole bunch of chronic ongoing conditions. That inflammation, that chronic underlying inflammation, is an explanatory factor, as well as the dysbiosis in the gut, is an explanatory factor in a whole bunch of chronic diseases. So heart disease, mental health, weight regulation. Basically, if you can think of it, it starts in the gut. And so the gut is the most important organ when it comes to our overall health. So when we talk about gut health normally, these are the things that we normally focus on. We talk about fruit, vegetables, whole grains, healthy balanced diet, and hydration. And these are the messages that we very typically share and the messages that we very typically use. And research shows that this is what both healthcare professionals and consumers are thinking about when they think about gut health. And I'm not saying that these are bad messages. These are great messages, definitely good for gut health. What I'm saying is there are certain challenges with these messages. And those challenges, as I see them, is that this advice is really vague. So we know from behavioural change models that people need specific advice to be able to action it into their everyday. So saying fruit, vegetables, whole grains, hydrate, a little bit vague for most people to implement, and we've been saying that for a long time now without much success. We also focus this messaging around undesirable foods. People don't necessarily love the fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and we need to talk to them about how they can enjoy those foods more. Also, ironically, fruit, vegetables, whole grains, that is 3/5 of this wheel. That is not representative of balance. It's ironically a very imbalanced way of promoting a healthy, balanced diet. And then we also exacerbate myths through our messaging. So when we say fruit, vegetables, whole grains, people hear the bit we didn't say. And what they hear is everything else in this wheel is not good for gut health. And then it becomes, by extension, that those other things are bad for gut health. And that's just not true. And I really want us to think, those of you who are in a space where you're sharing this information with people, really think about how we might have some unintended consequences in that messaging. And so I'm going to put the focus on another wedge in that wheel today. Our superhero for today is milk. I want to be very clear that when I say milk is a superhero for gut health, this is not a Superman versus Batman situation. I'm not trying to create a hero to displace all the other heroes. This is a group effort. This is the Avengers collective superhero kind of vibe. And milk is one of them. I don't know which Avenger milk would be, but maybe we'll figure that out later. And so I'm not saying forget the other messages. I'm saying let's talk about milk when we talk about the rest of the messaging. So first reason why, milk and the gut microbiome. So we know that the gut is home to a whole bunch of microbes, trillions of microbes in the human body. Most of them live in the gut, and most of those are bacteria. Those bacteria are linked to health through what they produce and through how they displace pathogenic bacteria. When we talk about the microbiome and gut health, we typically focus on fiber and prebiotics, and we typically conflate fiber and prebiotics as being the same thing. But the microbiome, the bacteria that live in the gut, digest a whole bunch more things than just the prebiotic fibers. In milk, the proteins, the lactose, the bioactive compounds, they're all getting digested by gut bacteria as well. So our gut bacteria eat what we eat, not just the fiber. What we eat also influences the environment in our gut, where those bacteria live. So influencing other receptors, influencing the pH, the environment. It's about their home, not just about their food. And so milk is involved in that overall environment. And through our gut health, we're influencing, as I said, those external organs. And our gut microbiome is important in regulating inflammation through biasing towards those good bacteria as opposed to the bad bacteria. Here's some specific data on milk and gut microbiome. Now, I want to be very clear that this is data just from 2 studies. So milk and the gut microbiome is an understudied area. But I want to be really clear that our most studied does not mean our most important or our most impactful. And so a call to action is that we do need more studies on this so that we can be having just as informed conversations around milk and the microbiome as we are other things. These are, however, 2 studies, and they are 2 high-quality studies. And what these studies did is they added milk to an otherwise healthy, balanced diet, so following the Australian Dietary Guidelines or following a Mediterranean diet. And adding the milk to the healthy, balanced diet showed that there was an increase in some of the good bacteria. So you can see there Lactobacillus, Bifidobacterium, Butyrococcus. You don't need to know much about the gut microbiome to probably have heard of them as good bacteria because they're linked to reduced inflammation, they're linked to reduced gastrointestinal infection and increased gastrointestinal integrity. We also know that when we add milk to the diet, we see a reduction in the bad bacteria. So I hate good and bad as a binary, but the bad bacteria are the ones that are associated with poorer health outcomes. So increasing inflammation and dysregulating cholesterol absorption. And so we know that there is a direct impact on the microbiome through adding milk. One of these studies was comparing to soy milk as the control. But other than that, there's not really good data on other types of milk, your plant-based milk alternatives, for this. And we often conflate the fact that plant-based milks are made from plants and plants are full of fiber and good for gut health with they will also be good for the gut in terms of what the plants do. So that's what we call a health halo, where there isn't actual evidence for the milks themselves, but it's carried through based on what they're made from. There's a lot of things you can think of that are made from plants that are not very good for you, though. So just have a think about that. So another thing that milk does in terms of supporting gut health is that it provides essential nutrients that are part of a healthy, balanced diet that do affect the gut directly. So for those of you who are in the nutrition and dietetics space, you'll know that our Guide to Healthy Eating is designed around distinguishing nutrients. So each of these food groups has some distinguishing nutrients that are obtained in greater amounts from those food groups. And through eating across these food groups, we achieve the optimal nutrition, get all the nutrients we need to survive. And so the distinguishing nutrients for the dairy group, which includes milk as a whole food, are protein, calcium, vitamin B2, and vitamin B12. Those nutrients are directly involved in maintaining gut health through maintaining gut integrity and maintaining the mucosal membrane. There's specific proteins in milk, specific amino acids that are in the proteins in milk, as well as the calcium are involved in those processes. How, we don't really know yet, whether it's a regulation of bile salts or pH. The proteins are involved, obviously, in the building blocks for the cell wall. And the B vitamins are involved in maintaining a healthy cell wall through their role in DNA production. So we're creating new cells. We need B vitamins to do that. This is really important because it's part of how milk could be involved in limiting inflammation in the gut and systemically. So when we have disruption to the gut wall, and when we have disruption to the gut microbiome, that's when we get the imbalance of inflammation. That's when we get things meeting things they're not really meant to meet, and we get those inflammatory responses. And so milk and having those nutrients in milk are really important for maintaining that. Milk is also really important as a facilitator of eating all those other foods that we talk a lot about. So fruit, vegetables, whole grains aren't necessarily the tastiest things, but we can use milk and dairy to make them more palatable for people. And so from everything from having a creamy vegetable dish through to creating smoothies to adding milk to cereal is a way of getting those high fiber foods to people in a way they like to eat. Because we've got this thing called the unhealthy tasty intuition, which is where people automatically believe that if a food is tasty, it's not going to be healthy. Or if a food is healthy, it shouldn't be tasty. And for me, milk can be part of that story where we say to people, add this thing that you actually enjoy to the foods we want you to eat. Rather than just talking about the optimal, we can bring people to where we want them to be through facilitating that eating. Milk is also super hydrating. So we talk a lot about hydration for gut health, and people actually in surveys it's shown people think a lot about hydration for gut health. And it's a real obvious one for gut function because obviously it's an aqueous environment that moves the nutrients from the gut to the blood, but also dehydration being a big risk factor for constipation. And when we talk about hydration, we do the same thing that we do with our gut health messaging. We focus on one thing and we say water is the best beverage. Okay, but milk is 87% water and it comes with a whole bunch of nutrients as well. And milk does different things in a culinary sense to what water does. So telling people water is the best, cool, but it's not going to do the same thing in a bowl of cereal or in one of those dishes. If you make your smoothie on water, it's a frappe, and that's not quite the same thing. And so including other options, not just the best option in this narrative, is really important to help people access these nutrients and access the hydration. So milk is often framed as the bad guy. There are a lot of myths around milk and gut health. And maybe when we said that we were going to talk about milk and gut health today, you thought that's what you were going to hear about. And there is data that shows that 1 in 6 Australians are limiting their milk intake because they are experiencing negative symptoms. And 75% of those people who are limiting their milk intake or avoiding milk intake are doing it because they perceive that milk is the cause of their negative gut symptoms. And most of that is based around the idea that we're lactose intolerant and that most people are lactose intolerant. And genetically, it is the mutation to be able to digest lactose. But that doesn't mean that most of us can't digest lactose. And there is a bit of a myth that it's a binary thing, that you're either in or out. Frank lactose intolerance, absolutely being unable to digest lactose, super rare. And most people sit somewhere on a spectrum where they can digest some lactose. And talking to people more about this and what could be the alternative cause of their gut symptoms is really important to help people keep that nutritious package of milk in their diet. And so I just want to bust that myth very clearly that quitting milk is not the way to improve gut health for most people. And there was a diet a couple of years ago where people were quitting dairy as a solution, and I'll talk in a minute about why that is not the solution. The other thing I want to address really quickly is the idea that plant-based milks and dairy milks are equivalents. So because they sit together in our guide to healthy eating and it says dairy and/or alternatives, an alternative is not necessarily an equivalent. And so lots of people are substituting with plant-based milk based on that assumption that they are equivalent, and they're not necessarily bringing the same nutrients. They're not bringing the same body of evidence behind them. And when they are bringing the same nutrients, they're typically fortified, and fortified nutrients don't necessarily act in the same way as naturally occurring nutrients that come with a food matrix. I also want to, I used to be an oat milk drinker, and I switched back to dairy milk when I read the study that said that plant-based milks, the calcium can settle out in the bottom, and if you don't shake it real good, you don't pour all of that calcium into the glass. Because I know who I am as a person, I knew that I would either not shake and I would be pouring that down the sink before I got rid of my Tetra Pak, or I knew I would be shaking my milk real good and it was going all over my kitchen, and I decided that I did not want either of those scenarios. I switched back to dairy milk. And so those two myths I want to address really clearly, and I think we need to talk to people a little bit more about the difference between an alternative and an equivalent. So the diet I was talking about, where everyone decided that quitting dairy about 10 years ago, dairy elimination diet was the fad for about 2 minutes, and I'm glad it didn't last any longer. And what we saw when people were doing that diet is a lot of people who were tolerant to dairy before they eliminated it struggled to reintroduce dairy into their diet after they fell off that fad wagon. And that's because we can train our gut microbes. So the ones that are digesting the lactose specifically, but all our other gut microbes as well. If we're not exposing them to what they're eating, what their preferred food source is, they are dying. The same thing happens with the carbohydrate digesting ones when you go on a low carb diet. And so we need to train gut microbes. We need to give them what they need to succeed. And when we reintroduce people to dairy, we need to do it slowly so that they can train those microbes over time. And when we do that, we need to think about our entire toolkit. And I'll just pause to say I made all my images today with AI, and I'm very proud with what AI has put out for me here in our milk toolkit. Magic Media on Canva. So this toolkit is really important to me because what it represents is using everything in our toolkit when it comes to gut health. And using everything in the toolkit applies to including milk as part of our healthy balanced diet story, but it also includes using our different types of milk. And A2 milk or A1 protein-free milk is one of those tools, and I want to talk to you about that in a little bit more detail. So I think it's pretty clear that AI didn't make this one. This is the one I stole from the A2 website. And this is showing you where A2 milk comes from. So I'll back right up for people who aren't familiar. The A1 protein-free milk, when people hear that this is a milk created with science, they think that the science might be in changing the milk or changing the cows. The science is in selecting the cows. So in the same way that some of us have blue eyes and some of us have brown eyes, and that's created by our genes, the cows, some of them naturally produce only the A2 protein, and some of them naturally produce the A1 and the A2 protein. Now, the differences in those proteins is literally just one amino acid. So if you remember from your early biology, amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, literally just one building block is different. And if you don't know much about biology, you might think that's not a terribly big difference, but one amino acid difference in a protein can completely change the way it behaves. And in this case, it changes where it's readily cleaved, where it's cut, where it's broken down in digestion. And this is why milk that's free of the A1 protein is digested differently to milk that contains it. And so we're getting it chopping in different places, and we're creating different products as we break it down. And that's why people are going to be responding differently to it. So here's some examples of studies that show that people do respond differently to the A1 free milk, A1 protein-free milk. And this data comes from studies across hours of intervals. It comes from multiple doses. It comes from single doses. It comes from up to 2 weeks. And so it's a big range of doses and timeframes that people are being given this milk, and it's comparing the A1 protein-free milk to milk that does contain the A. And across these studies, what you see is people report lower amounts of symptoms, so lowest improved symptom scores. So fewer symptoms for individual symptoms, but also holistically for improved gut health. Now, one thing that people often say when I talk about these studies is that these studies are only done in a specific type of people. And that's true. These studies are done in people who self-report being intolerant to lactose. So people who say drinking milk is not good for my gut. That's not a flaw in these studies, because those are the people that we want to help. So we wouldn't invent a new blood pressure tablet and test it on people who have normal blood pressure. So if we've got milk that might help people who are experiencing gut symptoms, it makes sense that we self-select people who are experiencing those gut symptoms. They're the exact people we want to help. I also want to be really clear, these studies are all what are called crossover studies. So crossover studies are where people act as their own control. So they'll get one milk for a period, then they'll have a washout period, and then they'll have the other milk. And they get randomized into those different groups. This is really important because it shows the variability between people and this range of responses. So often in science, we talk about averages and what the average response to something is, but really there's a huge range in responses, and the people who do benefit can have a significant benefit, and the people who don't benefit aren't necessarily seeing any harms. And so this study design is really powerful to show that diversity, and that's something that's really important. So why might these gut symptoms be different? So through that different digestion, what could be the mechanism that we're seeing? And what it looks like is that this mechanism is through the A1 protein-free milk limiting inflammation. And so we see in these studies, I say we, I didn't do any of these, I say we as scientists. These studies, we see reductions in serum inflammatory markers, so markers of inflammation in the blood. So that's showing that changing one thing in the diet, one thing in the gut is having those external effects to the rest of the body. We also see an increase in short-chain fatty acids. So short-chain fatty acids being one of the good things that the good microbes make that's linked to everything from controlling weight to reducing risk of heart disease and improving cognition. We're seeing increase in those in the fecal matter, which means we're improving the gut microbiome. We also know that in these studies, when we look at the relationship between inflammation and the symptoms, that relationship is only there if the A1 protein is present. And so that suggests that there is an actual mechanistic role where the A1 protein is triggering the inflammation or failing to limit the inflammation so that it's related to those symptoms. Not in everyone, but as a pattern. We also have a significant number of animal studies that back up these findings. And so we can't do every type of scientific research in humans, but the animal studies do back up. I said that I didn't do any of these studies, but FOODiQ Global is working on a similar study right now. So stay tuned for that research. Maybe next Gut Health Month, I can talk to you about that. It's a blinded study, so I don't know who's in what group at the moment, so can't give you any sneaky information. But we're looking at everything from gut health through to cognition, through to inflammation markers, and across a range of different people in different situations to see how they respond to the A1 protein-free milk compared to the traditional dairy. So stay tuned. Okay, so what can we do with this information? And so for me, ultimately, the take-home message is that if we look at the A1 protein-free milk, that there is evidence of benefits in some people, and those people could be anyone. So A1 protein-free milk won't necessarily help all people, but it can help anyone, could help some people. And you're probably thinking, well, that's very specific, and how do we figure out who needs it and who doesn't? But we do have a history in nutrition and dietetics of making recommendations that will help some people without harming other people, across the board. And salt is a really good example of that. So our guidelines for salt in Australia are based on the 30% of Australians who are salt sensitive. And those people, when they consume excess salt, will see a rise in their blood pressure. That's not everyone, but we know that reducing salt in everyone else's diets is not going to cause them a substantial harm, and so we make that recommendation. And so for me, if people are, I don't know if I need A2 milk or not, A1 protein-free milk or not, it can't hurt to try it. And remember what I said at the start, that it's not just about our symptoms. And so it's not just about going, gut health is for the people who are experiencing the symptoms. Maybe you would like to try the A1 protein-free milk. Because we can't necessarily see and feel every aspect of gut health, this could be beneficial for more people. So it won't necessarily be necessary for everyone, but it could help anyone. So if you're interested in how you can test whether someone's responses are coming from the A1 protein or coming from lactose, here's your little cheat sheet on how to do it. So the first thing is to do that awful, eliminate all the dairy from their diet, and that's eliminating every item of dairy, milk, and otherwise. And then you can do a trial period, and I like to tell people this is their own little crossover study. So they start with the A1-free, lactose-free milk. And while I'm talking about this, I do want to say I love that A2 milk has made an A1-free, lactose-free milk, because lactose-free milk is such a good tool in helping people to keep dairy in their diet. But it went out of fashion somewhere along the way, probably around the time plant milk came in. And so for me, for a brand like A2 to bring it back is really a signal that this is a useful tool in that toolbox. So when we start with the A1 protein-free, lactose-free milk, we have to introduce that slowly over time. So remember what I said about training those gut microbes. That's not just about the lactose, that's about everything that's in them. So over time, we build up from a small amount of milk to a standard 1 cup of milk over that week. And then if we're still symptom-free on the lactose-free and the A1-free, we can move to the A1-free milk with the lactose in it. If someone stays symptom-free at that point, it was never the lactose that was causing their symptoms. It was something else like the A1 protein in their milk. So this is a nice little experiment. Do it for National Science Week. Do it for Gut Health Week. Try it with your friends and you might see some benefits. So just to sum up, I just want to be really clear that we don't want to forget our superheroes like milk in our gut health story. And so we don't need to be sharing in the media or with our clients or with whoever we're talking to, we don't need to be sharing advice that is vague and boring and exclusionary that can have unintended harms. We can be sharing messages about gut health that are complete and inclusive and positive and clear. If in doubt, always refer people to see a dietitian, and I know there's a lot of dietitians in the room. Or if you're a dietitian and you have any doubt, you can ask a scientist and we can talk about the latest research in this space. I'll finish with a superhero quote because that was my theme for today, and I hope you've all enjoyed what AI cooked up. The superhero quote is from Batman when he said, "Anyone can be a hero." And anyone can be a hero and anyone might need a hero. And milk might just be that hero that people need. And the A1 protein-free milk might just be the superhero that they deserve. So please remember this in your conversations as you move forward. Thank you for having me. That's literally what too much means, yes. So too much is by definition going to be a bad thing. So too much of anything's a bad thing. And sometimes when people say I've had negative experiences with milk and gut health symptoms, it's because they've drunk a giant Stanley cup of mostly milk and a little bit of coffee. And so what is too much is going to look different to different people depending on the context. But one thing to be really clear on is our dietary guidelines, where we have our recommended number of serves, is about balance. They're not about limits. They're not about targets. It's about balance across those groups, and they are guidelines. They're not rules. There's very different ways of doing it. So yes, too much milk can be a bad thing, but too much anything will be a bad thing. And let's not confuse too much being bad with some not being good. There are no studies on that interaction, and I would love to study that interaction. Team A2, we should talk about this later, because that is really important, right? We don't eat foods or nutrients or proteins in isolation, and those interactions matter. And with caffeine, with coffee, with tea is a very common way that people are consuming milk. And this could be one of the reasons why we see people thinking they get gut health symptoms from milk, because they're having it with the coffee, they're having it with the tea. There's lots of things in caffeine, in coffee, not just the caffeine, but the acids as well that are changing gut function, speed, transit through the gut. And a lot of people do get that trigger to poop that comes from the acids that are in the coffee. And so for some people, that could be misinterpreted as being a gut health symptom. But whether or not changing that speed of digestion through other things, whether that changes the effects of the differential digestion of the protein, I don't know if that's clear. But what I do want to make clear is, for me, that's really interesting as a scientist. But that's not necessarily what we want the everyday person to focus on, because people are really focused on minutia and different combinations of different things being the optimal way to do things. And I always want to be careful that we don't, in getting more specific with what we understand as scientists for specific reasons, I don't want to get into that being like, you can have your milk, but not with your coffee, and it has to be after 10 a.m. and that kind of weird thing that people are selling online these days. So it'll be really interesting to find out. But I don't necessarily think that that's what we want to share with people. So yes, I think it's true. The science doesn't necessarily change people's mind. And that's why we've got to be really mindful of our narratives and those standard narratives around gut health and healthy eating. We've got to be really mindful, because people don't remember facts, they remember stories. And so telling people the story, I think, is really important in getting people to consider other behaviors. The other thing I'd say is we don't necessarily need to get people to change their minds, because there is lots of tools in that toolbox. And so what we want to be doing is offering people all of those potential tools, but respecting that people still will ultimately make their own decisions. And so there will be people who, no matter what the science says about health, are opposed ethically to dairy. And we do need to respect that. And this is not a competition. This is not about convincing people. It's about giving people their options. The other thing I'd say on the sustainability and environmental front is, I used to believe that plant-based milks were better for the environment, because I'd been told that just by lots of people. And it makes sense, because plants, right? They're good for the environment. But when you actually look on if you look on a per litre basis, which is what most of this data is around, because it's not for nutrition, it's for sales, and it's for agriculture, and it's for balance sheets of food movement around the world. If you look on a per litre basis, then yes, dairy milk does appear to have a worse footprint than your plant-based milks. But if you factor in the nutritional density of the dairy milk compared to the plant-based milks, the dairy milk comes right down, and a lot of the plant-based milks go right up. And so we need to remember that and it's been in the news this week, right? Milk and sustainability, and the dietary guidelines considering sustainability, and the meat industry isn't happy about it. When we consider sustainability, it is actually really important that we consider the nutritional context and what can people be getting out of that food, the bang for buck for the environmental footprint. Because I don't think there's any dietitian in the room who would say, well, if Coke had a lower footprint, I'd recommend it to people for environmental reasons. So if we're not buying that, then why would we be buying this story? So definitely think about nutrient density and think about storytelling. See, I just told a story there. You'll remember that one. frank lactose intolerance is rare. And when I say frank lactose intolerance, that means absolute lactose intolerance. And so some people, any lactose will cause symptoms. But for most people, there's strategies to be able to include lactose in their diet and increase its digestibility. So that looks like having your lactose spread in smaller serves across the day, having your lactose with food, because then that changes the way the lactose is interacting with the gut environment, and using things like the A1 protein-free instead to see whether it's responding. So for most people, it's not a binary, it's a spectrum, and we sit somewhere on the spectrum, and it's about, again, that toolbox and which tools we use to help people still include that nutritious food in their diet should they want to. So the lactose-free milk, the only change is that there's a pre-digestion step. So an enzyme is added, and that enzyme is going to split the lactose into the two smaller sugars. So it's not impacting the broader milk matrix. It's impacting just the pairing of those sugars. Whether or not there is unintended consequences that have not been thought through, positive or otherwise, needs to be studied in this combination, because it's only very recently that we have had the availability of A1-free and lactose-free milk together. I will also say, I think it's still true that we only have the A1-free, lactose-free milk on the eastern seaboard. They don't have it in Western Australia yet. Is that correct, A2 team? So you can create it yourself if it's not available, by adding a lactase tablet that has that enzyme in it. So that's the only change. There's no additional special processing that should be disrupting that availability. So I think this comes back to what I was saying about environmental footprint for value. And we need to get away from the simplified messaging that in a cost of living crisis, cheaper is better, full stop, because it's about value and the value that someone gets from that food. And if choosing the more expensive milk helps them keep milk in their diet, which then means they don't have to choose a whole bunch of other expensive options, then that can be a neutralizing effect. So for me, it's about value. What do you lose if you do cut milk versus what can you keep that is nutritious and affordable if you do keep milk? And so for me, this is another example of specific messaging, not having nuance in that message, rather than just going, food's expensive, buy the cheap stuff. It doesn't necessarily do anyone a service. So, yeah. You are right. People don't think like that, but that's where those of us who have the opportunity to share these messages with people have that responsibility to be telling them that broader story. So I think that's really important, something that we can all do better to help people do better for themselves.
Round of applause for Emma.